children, there are lots of very young people. This is in contrast to emerging Europe, which is depicted here with those squares, where the societies are somewhat older. You see a bigger bulge around ages above 30 to 65. So if you look at Georgia, Georgia very much resembles emerging Europe. It's a very similar situation. Most of the people, largest share of the population, these are people who are economically active, people who are in the labor force. But then if you look at younger generations, here they account for a smaller share of the population. So as years go by, this big bulge, the people who are now productive, they will become pensioners, and they will not necessarily be replaced by younger workers who will come of age. Now, what does it mean? It means that the old age dependency ratio will increase. By old age dependency ratio, I mean the share of people who are retirement age relative to the share of the people who are of working age. And in Georgia, this dependency ratio will reach 25% in about 2023. That is not similar to other countries. You see here that Korea or Iceland will reach the same dependency ratio at the same time, and countries like the US, Hong Kong, or Canada have already reached that. But the difference is that Georgia, as well as many transition countries, will reach this relatively high dependency ratio at much lower level of income. So here on the vertical axis, you see income per capita at the purchasing power parity relative to the level of the US. So US here is 100, right? While Georgia at the moment is around, or will be about a quarter, at the level of a quarter of the US level of income. So this is what I mean by saying that many of the transition economies may be getting old before they get rich. Now, demographic transition is one of the big forces that is driving this change. But there is another powerful force, which is emigration. Many people have been leaving transition countries to work in other places, in places they consider greening pastures. And that means that many transition countries have seen shrinkage in the labor force as a result of both emigration and lower birth rates. And this is going to matter because as we go forward, this will mean higher expenditure for pensions as well as higher expenditure for health. So how can one address this demographic challenge? One way of dealing with this is through automation. Instead of having more workers, you use robots. We have seen in the past 2 decades quite a dramatic increase in the stock of industrial robots. This has been on the way up very much in the European Union, at a somewhat slower level in the United States, and recently, in the last decade, enormous increase in China. In EBRD regions, we have not seen a big take-up of robots, presumably because labor costs are still much lower there. But we can expect that as this demographic transition progresses, more and more robots, industrial robots, will be introduced. And typically, what you see around the world is that there is a positive correlation between the age of the median worker and the number of workers, and the number of robots per worker. So you see here that in advanced countries, which are depicted with green dots, there are quite a lot of industrial robots, as well as a higher age of median workers. In emerging Europe, which is depicted here in blue, you see that the median worker is not so young, but the stock of robots is much lower than in advanced economies. So there is a lot of room for catch up. So automation is one of the trends I expect to see taking off in emerging Europe, presumably in the near future. And also, if you think about this pandemic and the possibility of other diseases, other perhaps epidemics, hopefully not pandemics coming in, robots have the advantage of not being sensitive to that. So the pandemic also increases the incentive on the part of firms to increase in automation. Now, automation is going to profoundly affect the labor market. It is going to primarily affect jobs in manufacturing sectors such as textiles, food products, agriculture, wood products, and transport. So many jobs in those sectors are going to be affected by automation, while services ranging from financial services, legal, telecom, computer programming, and education are less likely to be affected. Now, this has very big implications for the way societies should be educating young people and preparing them for entry into the labor force. As automation progresses, many of the jobs for manual workers are likely to disappear. Now, another way of addressing the demographic challenge is to extend the number of years people are working. So in other words, is through keeping older workers working rather than sending them to retirement. Eastern Europe, emerging Europe, differs a bit from G7 economies when it comes to labor force participation. So here, if you look at emerging Europe in those dark blue bars, you see that young people typically have a low labor force participation rate because they are still in education. Then when we look at individuals above 25 years of age, about 90% of them are active in the labor force, and the figures here are very similar in emerging Europe and in G7 countries. But then look what happens here. Once we cross the age of 50 or even 45, in emerging Europe, the share of men who are economically active goes down. And it goes down relative to the younger cohorts, but it also is lower relative to what we observe in G7. And this is particularly acute, this difference, if you look at people who are between 60 and 65. Basically, people in emerging Europe tend to exit the labor force earlier than in G7 countries. And this difference is particularly pronounced for women 55 years or older. So if you look at the data, in 2017, 3/4 of people between 50 and 64 were economically active in G7 countries. In EBRD regions, this was true of only 60% of people. So if we want to address the shrinking size of the labor force by keeping older workers working, there is quite a bit of room for maneuver because the employment rates are lower than in G7 countries. If you look at Georgia, here the situation, here the situation is, the decline is much slower than what you would expect in other parts of emerging Europe. Georgia here is denoted with those light blue bars. And here we see that employment rates among individuals 55 years of older are much higher than in G7 countries as well as in emerging Europe. And this is true for both men and women. Now, I mentioned the big implication of aging societies is paying for pensions. As the society ages, the number of retired people per economically active people declines. And here you see old age support ratios in 2015. These are the bars. You can see Georgia marked here. And the ratios we expect to see in 20 years. And you see that these ratios are going to go up by quite a lot, which has implications for the tax systems. Now, why aren't older workers in emerging Europe working? Why aren't people 50 years and above working? One explanation can be is that they are in a worse health conditions than their counterparts in G7 countries. Here you see the results of a Gallup poll, which asked people, tell us how good your health is. So this is people's perception of their own health outcomes. And you see here that, so these bars depict, the dark blue bars depict emerging Europe, while the green line depicts the values in G7 countries. So you can see that people in emerging Europe perceive themselves as much less healthy than people in the richest countries of the world. And this divergence already appears among individuals as young as 30, but it is particularly pronounced among older groups. And it's the gap is quite huge for individuals above 60. And it is true for both men and women. Actually, for women, even the gap is larger than for men. And the dark line, the black line with dots, that's Georgia. The pattern in Georgia follows very much the pattern in emerging Europe. So the message that emerges from the slide is that it will not be possible to keep older people working unless we think about ways of improving their health status. Of course, there are other challenges associated with keeping older people working. One of them is decline in skills. Here you see average skills scores. These are surveys conducted globally by the OECD that look at how good people are with numbers, with problem solving, with reading and comprehension. And you can see here that Japan has very high scores, very high in this respect, but there is this big drop off after the age of 50. And this drop off also takes place, it's also observed in advanced economies. In post-communist countries, the level of skills is lower than in Japan, but it's very comparable to other advanced economies. And fortunately, the drop off with age is actually lower. But so while older workers do well when it comes to sort of basic skills, in transition countries, they do worse when it comes to technology, when it comes to computer skills. Here again, these are data from the OECD, which show the share of population which has good ICT skills. And look now just at the green lines. These green lines depict the share of people who have good computer skills, people who are between the ages of 55 and 65. So these are the people whom we would want to keep longer in the labor force. And you see that in transition countries, the share of people with good IT skills among this age bracket is on average about 10%. That is much lower than what we see in Sweden, where it's 20%, or in the US, where it's almost a quarter. So if we want to keep older workers employed, I think this is one of the things that needs to happen. We need to invest in their IT skills. Now, let me spend a few minutes talking about more general changes to the labor markets. What we have observed globally are patterns such as deindustrialization and job polarization. And Eastern Europe, transition countries are no stranger to these patterns. So what we have seen is that traditional sectors, such as agriculture and manufacturing, have seen a decline in their employment shares in the economy. Right? So this is this deindustrialization. At the same time, we have seen an increase in employment in services, from construction, distribution, transport, business services, big increase, and non-market services. By non-market services, I mean healthcare, education, social work, public administration. And the same patterns are visible in Georgia, though they are somewhat less pronounced. You see big decline in agriculture, though much less of a change in manufacturing, and increase in services. So that was deindustrialization. Now, one consequence of that deindustrialization has been job polarization. Here's what I mean by this. I mean that we see a decline in jobs for workers with medium skills. Here, if you look at the red bars, you see that in many countries in emerging Europe, the share of jobs that require these medium skills, so these are not people with college education, these are people who have more than vocational education, these kind of jobs have been declining as a share of employment. And they have been replaced with high-skilled jobs in many cases. So these are the light green bars, or low-skilled jobs. So here the patterns depend on the country, but on average you see that in many countries in emerging Europe, this middle segment of jobs is disappearing, but the very low-skill and the high-skilled jobs are increasing as a share of employment. And that has, again, implications for how we would want to educate young people and prepare them for the future. So speaking of education, emerging Europe has experienced substantial improvement in educational attainment, but this improvement has been less impressive when it comes to computer skills. So this graph shows you on the horizontal axis the share of people who have college degree, who had college degree in 1990. And on the vertical axis, you see share of people who have a college degree, who had a college degree in 2016. So what you see is that in economies in EBRD regions, right, most of these countries are above the 45-degree line, meaning that the share of people who hold degrees has increased a lot between 1990 and 2016. Of course, we have experienced similar trend in Western countries, in industrialized countries, in advanced economies, and in many emerging markets, though perhaps not to the same extent in emerging markets. Overall, the world is getting more educated. What's worth pointing out is that countries such as Russia, Ukraine, and Estonia, they have a much higher share of people with tertiary education than many advanced countries, including the US. Now, if you does this better education translate into higher skills? So here we graph results of some of the OECD surveys, which measure people's literacy skills. And you see that there is certainly a relationship between income per capita and skills, but most of transition countries lie above the line, meaning that given their income, they have better skills than other countries at the comparable level of development. You can do this exercise in different way by combining number of years of education and adjusting them for quality. And here as well, transition countries marked as red squares do quite well. most of them have better attainment than other countries at comparable levels of income. But where they are doing worse is the computer skills, is the ICT skills. The red dots show ICT skills attainment for all age groups, while the blue diamonds show for young people, 25 to 34. And you see that in both cases, transition countries do worse than many advanced economies. So there is some room for improvement here. Now, as you recall, the demographic challenge is driven not just by changes in fertility rate, but also by outward migration. Could something be done about this? So first of all, let me just say that when we survey firms, and we have surveyed thousands of firms in many countries, what we have found is that in countries where there is a lot of outward migration, a larger share of firms report that they cannot find workers with the appropriate level of skills. So here, if you look at Lithuania, Romania, Latvia, Poland, these are the countries where a lot of citizens have emigrated, and the change between the share of firms that for whom this was a problem in 20 years ago now has increased by quite a lot. Moreover, if you look at survey results, these are now surveys of individuals, which ask people, do you have intention to emigrate? Would you like to leave your country to live somewhere else? These are surveys which are representative of the population structure. In each country, more than 1,000 people are being surveyed. And what you see that over time, in most economies where the EBRD is active, the share of people who would like to leave the country has been on the rise, though in Georgia the pattern looks quite different. Now, how could we keep these people at home? How could we create an environment such that they would find it worthwhile to stay in their country? And here we have found in our latest transition report is that people are very sensitive to the quality of institutions in their country. If they have faith that elections are conducted fairly, or that the national government is doing the right thing, or that the government is fighting corruption, that the courts are working well, that decreases their intention to leave their country. And the size of this effect is quite large. If you look at a country such as Albania, if people had confidence in government being effective at fighting corruption, that would lower their intention to leave Albania by as much as extra $400 a month in terms of income. So the impact of improving the institutional environment is quite large. It makes people more satisfied with life, and it makes them less likely to leave their country. Now, another development that has been observed in transition countries, as well as in other parts of the world, is this growing difference between people living in cities and in rural areas. Now, this technological progress, this enormous technological progress we have observed in last few decades has favored large urban agglomerations. IT specialists, creative type scientists, they all want to move to cities. They want to mingle there, come up with ideas, generate startups. We observe that the largest city in many countries has grown much faster than the rest of the country. So here, if you look here, this graph depicts change in the share of output, the national output of the largest metropolitan area. In most countries, this is the capital city. You see that in places such as Estonia and Romania, this was 6 percentage points. That means that during the first almost 20 years of the century, Tallinn and Bucharest increased their share of GDP by 6 percentage points. That's quite a lot. And you see that they were not alone. You see similar pattern in other places, including the United Kingdom. Moreover, the largest metropolitan areas have also increased their share of population. So people tend to move to cities because they know that in cities, even though the prices are higher, you tend to earn more because these agglomeration benefits make workers more productive and allow them to make more money. We see that in most countries, the GDP per capita in the largest metropolitan area is much larger than the national GDP per capita, right? In Paris, it's almost 3 times the national average. In Slovak Republic, Romania, Poland, and the Czech Republic, it's twice the national average, and so on and so forth. No, but of course, as people are moving to the largest metropolitan area, they have to be coming from somewhere. And in many cases, they are coming from secondary cities. So a very sort of recent but quite pronounced phenomenon observed in transition countries has been declining cities. Cities that are no longer attractive to their populations, and these cities are shrinking in size. But as they are shrinking in size, they get less in terms of tax revenue, which makes it much harder for the city authorities to provide services. Property values are going down. And that's quite a challenge for policymakers. However, perhaps the COVID pandemic will change that, because what we have learned during the pandemic is that in many professions, it is possible to work remotely. And going forward, many firms may continue with remote work or at least some kind of hybrid arrangement. And that may mean that it will suddenly become feasible to live quite far away from your workplace if you have to visit it only once a week or maybe once every 2 weeks. Moreover, many people now find large congested cities less appealing, and the pandemic makes them even less appealing. So perhaps we may see some shift in terms of people's preferences, where they want to live, and perhaps this will give some boost to secondary cities, to declining cities. Now, looking ahead, what policymakers are always concerned with is how to foster economic growth, how to make sure that the country will develop and do well and become richer. Now, the first 30 years of transition have been relatively easy because this was a catch-up growth. In most countries in the region, you just dismantled a centrally planned economy, you allowed prices to guide resources, you created a better business environment, you invested massively in new technologies, imported knowledge from abroad. It was catch-up growth. It was easy because you could import knowledge. And it's not a surprise that if you look at growth rates between 1998 and 2008, 3 percentage points of that growth were coming from improvements in total factor productivity. A big chunk was also coming from investment in capital, some from investment in human capital, but majority of that was the catch-up growth associated with productivity growth. But now growth has become harder. So since in the first few years after the financial crisis, actually we have observed on average no improvement in productivity in EBRD region. If there was growth happening, that was happening through capital accumulation. So the challenge is how to return to productivity growth, how to generate innovation that will allow countries become more productive and grow in that way. And what is somewhat less optimistic, if we look at transition countries, is that growth there has been spectacular, but it has been relatively light when it comes to innovation. So if you look here at the orange line, that's China, it experienced both growth and huge increase in innovation. This was true for South Korea as well as Turkey. While in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, there has been very, very little innovation. Now, how could you stimulate innovation? Well, one observation that emerges from the analysis we have done at the EBRD is that innovative firms are much more sensitive to the business climate. So we have looked at surveys of thousands of firms and we compared their perceptions of constraints to doing business. And basically you see that innovative firms are much more concerned about business climate. So if emerging Europe, if transition countries would like to use innovation to fuel future economic growth, they need to think seriously about improving business climate. And that means improvement in institutions. And there has been a lot of progress. Well, I don't want to diminish that, but a lot of progress in improving governance in transition countries happened early in the transition. And then in the last 10, 15 years, not much has happened. So what you see in this graph is you see the gap in terms of quality of institution. These are the World Bank indices of governance, which capture corruption, rule of law, regulatory transparency, and government effectiveness. And you see that the difference between high-income countries, so G7, and Central and Southeast Europe has been flat. And in part, it's driven by the fact that there was a lot of improvement in Eastern Europe as countries were acceding to the European Union, and then this reformist zeal fizzled away. There is no longer external anchor that would drive reforms. But these reforms, to eliminate this governance gap, are absolutely needed if these countries want to move to the next model of growth, innovation-led growth. Now let me just move on to the last part of my presentation. How does COVID-19 come into play here? Has it changed anything in the whole equation and the readiness of labor markets for the future? So one of the big impacts of COVID has been lower amount of FDI, foreign direct investment. And that happened because lockdowns have slowed down implementation of projects, because there is less profit, so fewer earnings are being reinvested. And we know that reinvested earnings are responsible for half of FDI flows on average. There was a reduction in cross-border mergers and acquisitions, in part driven by increased restrictions. And in general, this global recession has lowered appetite for new investments. So according to UNCTAD, we are going to see a major drop in global FDI flows this year, on the order of 40% relative to last year. And they don't expect any recovery next year. So basically, global FDI flows are going to remain below their trough, which we observed after the global financial crisis, at least until 2022. And if there is less FDI, FDI is not just flow of capital, it is primarily flow of knowledge. If there is less knowledge flowing across borders, then there is less scope for productivity growth. So that is one of the effects of COVID. The second one is rethinking of global value chains. So early in the pandemic, the world has realized just how dependent it is on suppliers concentrated particularly in China. So these are suppliers not only of antibiotics and medical equipment, but now also in the European Union, we also talk about dependence on Chinese supply of rare earth and other materials needed, for instance, for batteries for electric cars. So we are going to observe some rethinking of global value chains. The pandemic has drawn attention to the fact that the longer the global value chain, the higher the possibility that it will be hit by some shock, some extreme weather shock, or some policy shock, such as trade barriers. So we are going to see some relocation. Now, this relocation of global value chains creates opportunities for transition countries, which can increase their participation in export markets. So they can capture part of the Chinese market share. And here you can see this graph depicts products where there is potential for this happening. So on the horizontal axis, you see types of products which are to a large extent imported by Germany from China. And on the vertical axis, you see comparative advantage of countries where EBRD operates. So you see that there's a lot of possibility for relocation. But the interesting question from the perspective of this conference is, will this argument extend to IT sector, to back office services, to call centers, to other ICT services? Early in the pandemic, there was a bit of a concern whether lockdowns in India will disrupt provision of back office services. This hasn't happened, but I wonder whether there will be increased focus on resilience and some push to diversify provision of back office services. And if so, this is again opportunity for countries in our region to get plugged in, get part of that market share. The second consequence of the pandemic is that from one day into another, we have been thrown into this great experiment of remote working. Before, this was to some extent happening, but there was a lot of hesitation. Managers were worried that workers would not work very hard at home. Workers were worried that if they are not seen by their managers, they will not get promoted. So there was not much of a momentum. But then the lockdowns happened, and from one day to another, thousands of firms started remote work. Now, once you cross the psychological barrier to do remote work, many firms will probably continue. Many firms will find it very appealing to save on office space, particularly office space in expensive locations. But once you cross this psychological barrier to remote work and you are a firm in London, why limit yourself to UK workers? Why can't you hire somebody from Georgia, from Poland, or from Armenia? So I think remote work creates a lot of possibilities for the region, for transition countries, which have quite well-educated labor force. And we know that, globally, we have already benefited from differences in wages of unskilled workers. Services, differentials in wages of skilled workers are the next frontier. And that's where I would expect some movement. So I hope that this is the opportunity that will be seized by Georgia and other countries. Every crisis creates some opportunities. And the challenge is how to identify them and how to seize them. Thank you.
Thank you, Beata, and thank you to you all. And now we have a reception just in front in Republic. And just to those who wonder, because they've seen some news, it's clean from Corona, and it's at the rooftop there. So just to cross the street and to keep the socializing with the distancing there. Please, thank you.